tissue to the CNS is afferent. From the CNS out to this effector tissue is going to be efferent, okay? So make sure you make that note on your slide. So let's begin by looking at the anatomy of the sympathetic nervous system, right? And we talked about it sort of briefly. We described that there is a shorter preganglionic neuron which synapses onto this ganglia. Now, the area where these ganglia communicate, this is called the sympathetic chain, okay, the sympathetic chain. And this is a collection of all these sympathetic autonomic ganglia. Now, this is a real structure in the body, right? So if you open up the thoracic region and you remove the abdominal contents and you look in the posterior abdominal wall, running alongside the spinal cord on either side is this nervous system structure, and this is the sympathetic chain. And all it is a collection of all the autonomic ganglia where the sympathetic preganglionic neurons synapse onto the sympathetic postganglionic neurons, okay? So again, there's a short preganglionic neuron, this smaller neuron here, and a long postganglionic neuron that goes from the sympathetic chain out to each of these effector organs or tissues, okay? Again, I want to point out here, they're coming specifically from the lateral horn or the intermediolateral cell column, okay? So that lateral part of the cut section of the spinal cord. Now, there's an exception to that general rule. There are two other ways that the sympathetic nervous system can communicate, okay? So just going from the spinal cord to the autonomic ganglia to the effector tissue is only one of three ways that the sympathetic nervous system can communicate. And I'm going to say that again, okay? Going from the spinal cord to the autonomic ganglia to the effector tissue is only one of three ways that the sympathetic nervous system communicates. The other two ways are via collateral ganglia and the adrenal medulla, okay? So the sympathetic nervous system has three routes of communication. That easy communication from the spinal cord to the ganglia to the effector tissue. That's the majority of what we see, okay? The other options is that it can go to a collateral ganglia. This is a ganglia that's not a part of the sympathetic chain. And I'll go back to this slide, okay? So we have some ganglia that are part of the sympathetic chain, and then we have some collateral ganglia, specifically the ganglia that control our gastrointestinal organs. So these are not a part of the sympathetic chain, and that's the second option of communication. Okay, synapsing onto a ganglia that's not in the sympathetic chain. The third route of communication involves the adrenal medulla, okay? And we're gonna talk about the adrenal gland. They sit above your kidneys, and they have two distinct layers. There's a cortical layer, right, which secretes corticosteroids, and there's a medulla. Now, the medulla is the area that we are interested in. It's the darker staining, deeper internal part of the adrenal gland. And the adrenal medulla releases catecholamines, epinephrine, norepinephrine, and some dopamine. Now, the way that this becomes a sympathetic route of communication is that we have preganglionic neurons synapsing onto the chromaffin cells of the adrenal medulla, and the chromaffin cells will then act like postganglionic neurons. This is a very important understanding or point to understand, right? There's a preganglionic neuron, it synapses onto a chromaffin cell, and the chromaffin cell acts just like a postganglionic neuron. It doesn't look like a postganglionic neuron, it's not a neuron, but it has those properties. In fact, if you take a chromaffin cell and you put it in the right medium, it will actually begin to grow axons, okay? And so these are nothing but modified postganglionic neurons, in such that they don't look like neurons, but they behave, they release neurotransmitters just like a neuron does. So I'll say that again here. This is very important. Three routes of communication for the sympathetic nervous system. One is from the CNS to the autonomic ganglia, which is in the sympathetic chain, then to the effector tissue. One is from the CNS to a ganglia that is not in the sympathetic chain, then to its effector tissue. The third one is from the CNS onto the chromaffin cells that are in the adrenal medulla, and the chromaffin cells will act like that postganglionic neuron. okay? And they release these catecholamines, which act like neurotransmitter. Okay, this is another important thing, point to make here. These catecholamines, when they enter the blood, they become hormones, but they act just like neurotransmitter. In fact, the only difference between a hormone and a neurotransmitter is that hormones are released into the blood. So if you release a neurotransmitter into the blood, it becomes a hormone, okay? And so these are released into the blood. Most of it is epinephrine. Some is a modified norepinephrine. And these basically flood the system very rapidly. Now, I'm going to continue to harp on this point, but the main difference here is this response makes the sympathetic nervous system very amplified. This is why if you're running from a bear or a tiger, you don't have time for that one neuron to the other neuron to the other neuron. You want this neurotransmitter to be flooding the system very quickly, and that's what the adrenal medulla and the chromaffin cells do. Okay, they release this neurotransmitter into the blood, it goes everywhere in the body, and you're sort of alert and awake and fleeing or whatever you need to do very quickly, okay? So take-home points here, 3 routes of communication, the third route being responsible for the amplified response of the sympathetic nervous system, okay? All right, so these are the 3 routes of communication that I mentioned. This is the first route. This is the second route onto this chromaffin cell. And then the third route is onto some other ganglia that is not a part of the sympathetic chain, okay? All right, let's look at the anatomy of the sympathetic nerves and how they differ. You guys need me to go back? Just flag me down if I'm going too fast, please. Okay, so let's look at the anatomy of the sympathetic nervous system. Okay, and again, we're going to start with this cross section. So we took a cross section of the spinal cord, right? And we have the dorsal horn, the lateral horn, the ventral horn. Okay. Okay, so our spinal cord, this would be the preganglionic part of the neuron, the ganglia, and then the postganglionic part of the neuron, okay? So let's just make a note of that here. This should be ganglionic. Okay, now, the fibers that arise from the autonomic nervous system come from what part? What part of the spinal cord? The lateral horn, right? So they come from the lateral horn. Let me remind everyone, let's remind ourselves of what these are. So this is the dorsal horn. This is the lateral horn. And this is the ventral horn. Okay, our fibers are coming specifically from the lateral horn. Please remember that, okay? Now, because they're coming from the lateral horn, they need to take a ride on the ventral root, okay? The spinal cord segment entering here has 2 roots. There's a dorsal root and a ventral root. And so the fibers that are exiting from the lateral horn exit through the ventral horn and into the ventral root, okay? And they travel in this general direction. Now, this part of the neuron, which we said is the preganglionic neuron, this is going to be myelinated, okay? And this is myelinated, and we call this white ramus, okay? So this is myelinated, and so we call it white ramus or a white ramus fiber. right? Now, the fiber is going to leave the lateral horn, travel, exit the spinal cord into the ventral root. This becomes in the spinal nerve at this point, and it is going to synapse here onto the ganglia, or at the ganglia rather. And it's going to synapse onto the postganglionic neuron. So this is the second neuron here. Now, at this point, when we get into the postganglionic neuron, the fiber changes. It's no longer myelinated and white ramus. It is unmyelinated here, and we call it gray ramus, okay? So at this point, it is unmyelinated, and we call it gray ramus. Okay, it's a gray ramus fiber, and we talked about the difference between gray and white matter, gray and white rami, and that's just a staining appearance because of the loss or the absence or presence of myelin, okay? So let's talk about this here again. We have a cross-section of the spinal cord. We talked about the 3 areas on that cross-section. Dorsal horn, this is responsible for sensory. We'll talk about that later on. Ventral horn, this is responsible for motor, right, or autonomic function. The lateral horn, this is responsible for the autonomic stimuli. Now, the autonomic, the soma of the autonomic neuron, the soma of that preganglionic neuron starts in the lateral cell column, but it hitches a ride on the ventral root into the spinal nerve. In this first part, right, in this preganglionic neuron, it's myelinated, and it's a white ramus fiber here. It synapses onto this ganglia, right? So this is our autonomic ganglia. And then from this ganglia, the fiber changes now. It's no longer myelinated, right? It's unmyelinated here. It re-enters the same spinal nerve and makes its way to the effector tissue, okay? All right. Any questions on this? Any questions on this bit? Okay. All right, so let's move on here. Okay. So this is kind of what we spoke about. This is the communication of the autonomic nervous system, specifically the sympathetic division. All right, this preganglionic fiber leaves the lateral horn, exits through the ventral root, travels to that ganglia as a white ramus fiber, leaves that ganglia as a gray ramus fiber, re-enters that spinal nerve and makes its way to the effector tissue, okay? Very important for you to understand what's happening here. Now, if it goes to a collateral ganglia, it will not synapse onto the sympathetic chain, but instead it will travel to that ganglia, which is usually around the gastrointestinal tract. It'll synapse onto that ganglia and then to its effector tissue. Okay, so the same scenario. The big picture here is that the preganglionic part of the neuron is myelinated, and the postganglionic part is unmyelinated. Okay, myelinated, then unmyelinated.